All right, Congressman, we're live in the broadcast.
Natalie, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Cornell University Institute of Politics and Global Affairs conversation with General H.R. McMaster. Tonight, we're going to delve into his exquisite book, Battlegrounds, and we're joined by Chris Reback, our usual partner for these book conversations, as well as Cornell professor Sarah Kreps. I'm going to introduce both of them properly in just a moment. I do want to acknowledge some special guests who are joining us viewing this tonight. Peggy Koenig, the co-vice chair of the Board of Trustees at Cornell University, and Craig Kaiser, the chair of the executive committee. Jan Rasmussen, a member of the Board of Trustees at Cornell. Former Congressman Bill Enyart, former congressman from Illinois, and New York State Assemblyman Chuck Levine. Before we begin, folks, just a little bit of housekeeping. The Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell seeks to strengthen democratic norms and build resilience around democracy by deepening discourse and raising understanding. We are relentlessly nonpartisan. Our guests have ranged from White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and a long list of members of Congress and senators and ambassadors and pundits. Upcoming webinars tomorrow night, if it's free on your schedule, join us at 7 for the State of Global Anti-Semitism, a report from Abe Foxman, who was the head of the Anti-Defamation League. Next Tuesday, a week from tonight, also at 7, the 2020 election and the future of polling, a conversation that so many pundits are having right now. That will be moderated by CNN's S.E. Cupp. Will feature a prominent Democratic pollster and a prominent Republican pollster. And you can check on our events by just Googling Cornell Institute of Politics or going to iopga.cornell.edu. Tonight's format will feature a conversation with General McMaster, followed by your questions and answers. At about 6:40, Natalie will give you directions on how to be recognized for a question, and we have a hard stop at 7 p.m. And now to our guests. Chris Reback is the host of Chris Reback's Conversations. He publishes Chris Reback's newsletter, which is a daily email that cuts through all the clutter and all the noise and connects ideas to what's happening in the world and helps us figure things out succinctly. He's the host of podcasts on politics, business, technology, science, education, and the arts. And his Political Wire Conversations has been ranked number 3 on iTunes in the news and politics category. He's also the co-author of the book, You Won, Now What? How Americans Can Make Democracy Work from City Hall to the White House. Also, Sarah Kreps. She is the John L. Withdrawal Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University, Adjunct Professor of Law, Faculty Fellow in the Milstein Program in Technology and Humanity at Cornell's Tech's campus in New York City. She's written 5 books, including the forthcoming Social Media and International Relations, Taxing Wars, The American Way of War Finance and the Decline of Democracy, Drones, What Everyone Needs to Know, Drone Warfare, and Coalitions of Convenience, United States Military Interventions After the Cold War. And she served as an active duty officer in the United States Air Force. And of course, General H.R. McMaster. Currently the Fowden Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1984, served as an Army officer for 34 years, retired as a lieutenant general in 2018, and remained on active duty while serving as the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. He taught history at West Point, holds a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm very proud to say that he also serves on the Council of Advisors of the Campaign for the Future of Democracy, a project of the Cornell Institute of Politics to build resilience towards democracy. Now, a point of personal privilege, as I recognize the general, I'll tell you where our relationship began. As a young member of Congress, I had really the extraordinary privilege of serving on the House Armed Services Committee. And that committee has jurisdiction over all national security issues. And I noticed fairly quickly that most of the members of the committee, all of them were deeply involved and committed and dedicated to the national defense of the United States on both sides of the aisle. But I noticed that there were some members who were particularly focused on making sure that a base or an installation wasn't threatened in their states, and other members who really took an interest in particular defense technologies. And I did not have a base in my district on Long Island, no installation to speak of on Long Island. We had this little mom and pop company called the Grumman Corporation, which really didn't need my help. They were doing fine without me. And so that gave me the ability to really delve into issues that didn't get a lot of attention. And as somebody with a passion for history, I began to wonder how we train and teach our troops. What kind of history do we teach them? Do we teach them the timeless lessons of Sun Tzu and Clausewitz? We invest so much in military hardware, and I was curious to, what do we invest in software? What kind of professional military education opportunities do we provide for our warriors? And everywhere I went, I was told the guy you have to talk to, the one guy who knows more about this than anybody else, is H.R. McMaster. He gets it, he understands it. And that proficiency, that depth is absolutely reflected in his book, Battlegrounds. So when I was reading it, General, it just reminded me of our time together. And I have to, before I really welcome you, I have to tell you, I get two questions in this before turning it over to Chris and Sarah. And it was very hard for me to choose just two because the book was just so wonderful. General, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Steve. It's so great to be with you. And thanks for your leadership over so many years. You really were a visionary in connection with professional military education. You had a big impact across our armed forces. And now you're having a huge impact in helping to bring Americans together to work together, to overcome the challenges we're facing and to take advantage of opportunities to reverse some of this vitriolic partisan trend toward vitriolic partisanship and to come together for sensible, respectful conversations. And what a privilege it is to be with you for this event and to support your efforts in that connection. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let's plunge right into the book. Early on in the book, you talk about arriving in Washington to serve the president as a national security advisor. And you get to Washington and you write that 2 days later, you convened an all hands where you shared with the National Security Council staff your concern that the US had submitted to what is called strategic narcissism in its foreign policy and its national security. And you write about strategic narcissism as opposed to strategic empathy. Help us understand what you mean.
Right. Well, thanks, Steve. Of course, I came into the White House quite unexpectedly. I was walking down Walnut Street in my hometown of Philadelphia when my phone rang and said, "Hey, can you come to Mar-a-Lago for an interview with the president this weekend?" And I said, "Well, okay." And I wound up there on Sunday, and the president hired me on Monday. I flew back on Air Force One. They flew me back to my house in Tidewater, Virginia, so I could pack a bag and come back the next Tuesday, the next day, and start work in the White House. So I was very grateful for the opportunity to have read and researched and thought about and written history, the history of Vietnam War decision making in a book called Dereliction of Duty, and I was determined to avoid at least to avoid making the same mistakes as I'd written about in that period, and so I talked in this all hands to our team about what my assessment was overall of the degree to which we're able to conduct an effective foreign policy and an effective national security strategy, and just to highlight the fact that I thought we had a lot of work to do to restore our strategic competence, because our strategic competence had dissipated in the post-Cold War period, mainly because, as you've already mentioned, of this phenomenon of strategic narcissism, our tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and then assume that what we decide to do or what we decide not to do will be decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. Now, of course, this kind of thinking is wrong because it's self-referential and because it doesn't acknowledge the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have, and in particular, rivals and adversaries and enemies. And in the post-Cold War period, strategic narcissism led to, I think, a very high degree of over-optimism. After the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the lopsided victory over the fourth largest army in the world in Desert Storm. And it was in this period of time that I think we made three flawed assumptions about the post-Cold War period, that an arc of history had guaranteed our primacy over our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. a related assumption that great power competition was a relic of the past. And a third, and I know you're very much aware of this, Steve, is this orthodoxy of a revolution in military affairs, that the technological military prowess that we had demonstrated in Desert Storm would guarantee our security way into the future. And there was that hubristic language of, full spectrum dominance over any potential enemy and so forth. And I think, Steve, this was all set up, right? It was a setup for shocks and disappointments in the 2000s. The mass murder attacks of 9/11, when terrorists bypassed our technological military prowess. And then, of course, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, we often debate, Steve, should we have done it? Meaning, should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? Heck, I think we ought to debate who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy?
Mhm.
And of course, the neglect of continuities in the nature of war is one of the answers to that. And then the third disappointment was the financial crisis. And it was during this period of time, I think, as the Obama administration came in, that emotional impetus behind our policy shifted from over optimism to pessimism and resignation, and a belief that our disengagement from complex problem sets was an unmitigated good. So I shared this interpretation of foreign policy over the last 2 decades with the team at the National Security Council staff, and I told them that we would work together to improve our strategic competence and to help shift the balance back in favor of the United States.
Let's talk about something that you write about, and something that the Cornell Institute spends a lot of time on, and that's democracy. You begin the book, preface of the book, you say, and I'm quoting, "The polarization of America's polity and that of other free and open societies is destructive. And I wanted to write a book that might help transcend the vitriol of partisan political discourse and help readers understand better the most significant challenges to security, freedom, and prosperity." General, so how do you assess the state of democracy in the United States and around the world today?
Well, I think the state of democracy, Steve, is strong, but it's under duress, right? And the reason I think it's strong is, I just reject, the sort of predictions of doom and the end of our democracy that has become actually commonplace these days. And the points that you hear these days are, of course, that, gosh, we're so divided. Okay, well, if we weren't divided, we'd be a one-party system, maybe, and that looks like China to me. So division's okay. The other thing I often hear is that people have lost faith in our democracy. Well, record numbers of Americans voted. The other thing I hear is that our institutions are weak. Well, President Trump has challenged our institutions in a pretty brazen way, right, with these claims of widespread fraud and everything, and the adjudicative processes associated with these lawsuits. It's working, right? Our institutions, at least to me, appear strong. But what I fear is this polarization as people move toward extremes, and how the extremes have the loudest voices. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that we are better connected to one another these days, Steve, electronically, and more distant from one another psychologically and emotionally. I think it has to do with the information environment that we're in, and that how social media uses algorithms to get more advertising money and more clicks, and the way to do that is to show users more and more extreme content that move us further away from each other. I'll tell you, I don't think the mainstream media is helping at all these days, really. If you lean one way politically, right, you watch one cable news station. If you lean the other way, you watch one of two others. If you don't adhere to the orthodoxy of the New York Times, you can't write op-eds for them. I think that the fourth estate needs some work in terms of our information environment. And then we have this kind of pseudo media where these conspiracy theories proliferate. And so I'm worried about that. I'm worried also about, the lack of confidence in who we are. I write a lot in the book about strategic competence, but in the conclusion in particular, I emphasize the need for us to restore our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes and in our identity. And Steve, I worry these days about this destructive interaction
Mhm.
between identity politics, whatever you want to call it, on one end of the spectrum, and bigotry and racism on the other. And this interaction creates these centripetal forces, right, that are spinning us apart from one another. And so this is why I think we all have to do our part, like the Institute is doing its part, like you doing your part, to convene Americans around the challenges and opportunities that we're facing, and to have respectful, meaningful discussions that maybe even prioritize in that discussion, hey, what do we agree on? Because I mean, I think if we just get that far in these discussions, we can get a lot done, and we can still disagree on quite a bit. But I think there's more of a consensus on what we need to do to build a better future for generations to come than is apparent these days.
That and other deep thoughts are in this great book. Forgive me for the glare, but folks, Battlegrounds, H.R. McMaster, I highly recommend it. You download it, available at your local bookstore. Support your local bookstores, by the way. Get this book. And Chris and Sarah, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve, very much. And certainly we are looking for agreement. One of the things I think we all can agree on, General, is we all loved your book. It wasn't just Steve's, long relationship. I can say confidently we all enjoyed it. And I confess, Steve just introduced that I'm here with Sarah. I do feel like I'm cheating a bit. I feel like I'm in that movie line theater, and I've got Marshall McLuhan behind the vending machine. And if you answer anything wrong, I'm going to go to Sarah from behind the vending machine, and she's going to call you on it. So please be careful.
I'd expect nothing less from Sarah. Thanks. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, me either. So you're among your many roles, and Steve has outlined so many of them. You're a historian and you're a military man. And those two pillars really establish the framework for your book. And you set out the book's thesis with the simple line, quote, "As a trained historian, as well as a soldier, I believed that old saying, the military is always prepared to fight the last war, was wrong." So what war should we be preparing to fight now? And what lesson from our last war, whether that's Afghanistan or Iraq or ISIS, but what lesson would be the wrong one to apply going forward?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, Chris, what I think many historians will tell you, some of my old colleagues in the Department of History at West Point, Robert Doty or Eugenia Kiesling, what they've found is that militaries that study their last war only superficially and don't really learn from it are those that are set up for the greatest difficulties in the future. And what I argue in the book is that understanding how the past produced the present is the first step in trying to anticipate the future. And when we neglect lessons from the past, I think we're kind of arrogant, right? Because we're saying, "Hey, all I need to know is my lived experience, right? I don't need to learn from others who have gone before me." And I think the study of history is therefore an exercise in humility. I think oftentimes our policies and strategies are based on fundamentally flawed assumptions having to do with an unrealistic expectation of the degree of agency we have over the future and a neglect of the other. And this is why in the book, I argue for a strong dose of strategic empathy and to pay particular attention to the ideology and the emotions and aspirations that drive and constrain others, and to view the complex challenges we face from the perspective of others. I think history sensitizes us to that. And if without the knowledge of history, I think there's a tendency, right, toward optimism bias, toward confirmation bias, toward trying to fit complex challenges into neat formulas, really, that don't hold up. And so, I think we've demonstrated, Chris, an inability to learn from even our most recent historical experience. I'll just point to one example to get to your question, because I know we want to go into other issues, but I think what we're doing in Afghanistan right now seems to be utterly uninformed by the complete withdrawal from Iraq in December 2011. When, remember, then Vice President Biden calls President Obama and says, "Thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war." Well, of course, wars don't end really when one side disengages. And what we had is then the need to deploy forces back into Iraq to contest with the most destructive terrorist organization in history. This is ISIS, or Al Qaeda in Iraq 2.0, an organization of unspeakable brutality that was then in possession of territory the size of Britain. I think we're doing the same thing in Afghanistan right now, Chris, and don't recognize that if we prioritize withdrawal over our enduring interests there, we're likely to be back. We're likely to witness a humanitarian catastrophe of colossal scale, as we did associated with ISIS, and it's disappointing. It's disappointing. So the argument in the book is to learn really from history, and in particular our most recent history, and so to improve our degree of competence and our ability to to build a better future.
Yeah, that certainly comes across. Let's make sure that you were right on your answer and go to our historian, Professor Krebs.
Thanks, Chris. I would like to say I'm a historian, but I'm a political scientist, so don't hold me to account on historical details. But I'm going to try to hold the general to account, because that segues nicely into one of the questions I had. Because when you were talking about Afghanistan and learning from history, I mean, just to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit here, isn't another lesson from history that Afghanistan is, quote, a graveyard of empires? And so how is that not the lesson? What lessons should we be gleaning from history? And maybe I'll just add to that, since you wrote a book on Vietnam, it seems like since Vietnam, the American military has been pretty good at maybe not losing wars, but not winning them. And so I'm curious, what would you say is the last war that the US military won? Why have we become so good at not losing, but not actually winning? And so it seems, though, that since we are these good soldiers, and as Americans, we're good at persevering, we do stick it out, and we continue to see our interests in places that, now we've been in Afghanistan for 2 decades. How do these wars end? And how can we be better at actually winning rather than just not losing?
Well, I would just say that on Afghanistan and the graveyard of empires thesis, I write in the book that the only thing worse than the ignorance of history is the abuse of it. And I think that this sort of conventional wisdom that Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires, therefore we're doomed to fail there, is in itself really ahistorical, because it doesn't acknowledge the fact that we are really partnering with the Afghan government and the 90+% of the Afghan people who reject the Taliban to help them secure the freedoms that they've enjoyed since the end of Taliban rule in 2001. And of course, to pursue our complementary and consistent interest with theirs to deny terrorist organizations a safe haven and support base, such that they would be able to conduct another mass murder attack on the scale of 9/11. I would say that that's worked, since 2001 at too high of a cost and for too long. What I describe in Battlegrounds is that really the Afghan war has not been a 2-decade-long war or a 20-year war. It's been a 1-year war 20 times over. And we have demonstrated really an astounding degree of strategic narcissism in Afghanistan, because we tried to take this short-term approach to a long-term problem, and therefore paradoxically actually lengthened the war and incurred greater costs. We've taken it to an extreme form now with this negotiated settlement with the Taliban, during which we made extraordinary concessions to put the Taliban in a position of advantage over the Afghan government, and we did it under the assumption that there's a bold line, between the Taliban and other terrorist organizations, including Al Qaeda, which doesn't exist. That bold line doesn't exist. These groups exist in a terrorist ecosystem in which they share people and they share resources and training and often leadership, and so we've created this this myth, and then also we've also created the enemy we would like, and by assuming that maybe the Taliban got better, maybe they're going to put into place a more mild form, an enlightened form, maybe a benevolent form of Sharia in Afghanistan as they strive to reestablish the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And we actually see it in areas where the Taliban's in control, where the first thing they do is destroy the girls' schools. The first thing they do is line up and shoot, the people who they think will not adhere to their perverted interpretation of religion. And so, I think that this is, in Afghanistan, it's an exercise in self-delusion that's ahistorical, not informed by history. And in terms of what we can learn from history and how we apply it to your second question of, are we winning and how do we win? I think what has happened is, because of what I write about in the book, these assumptions associated with, the end of great power competition, this belief in the revolution in military affairs, say that really, really, really the next war is going to be fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it. What we have seen is a bias in favor of change and a neglect of continuity in the nature of war. You know, the historian Carl Becker said in an address before the American Historical Association in the 1930s, he said that memory of past and anticipation of future should walk hand in a happy way without one disputing primacy over the other. And when you neglect continuities in the nature of war, like, hey, war is an extension of politics, right? You might react to that by saying, well, everybody knows that. It's kind of like the Geico commercial, right? Everybody knows that war's an extension of politics. What that means is that you have to consolidate military gains to get the sustainable political outcomes in any other kind of mission that's different, you know, from even a raid or, you know, an operation of short duration and planned withdrawal. War is an extension of war is human, you know, and people fight for the same reason Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago. So I think it's really important for us to understand continuities. War is uncertain because of a continuous interaction with the opposites. You know, what we did in Afghanistan is when we reinforced the security effort there in 2009, we announced the timeline for our withdrawal at the same time. How does that work? Do you give the enemy your script for future events and just ask them to adhere to it? And then, of course, war is a contest of wills. And when you announce your withdrawal, you're bolstering the will of your enemy. Winning in war requires convincing your enemy that your enemy cannot accomplish his objectives through the use of force. And what we have done in Afghanistan, as an example, is completely disconnect what we're doing militarily from what we're trying to achieve diplomatically. And that's why we've been doomed to failure, is because of an astounding degree of incompetence, an incompetence that is based in large measure on our neglect of history and continuities in the nature of war.
General, I want to pick up on one of the points that Steve asked about earlier, and I'm hoping you can put it into historical context, as you were just referencing. As with your book, you're taking us right now in a bit of a span of the globe: Afghanistan, Iraq, ISIS, other locations. You talked about the great power competition, which of course raises questions about China and Russia. But at the same time, if you're examining threats to American security, should you have had a chapter on the United States? To the question Steve asked you earlier, how do you balance any domestic risk between internal versus external factors?
Well, you know, I talk about the United States and the importance of maintaining our will and our ability to compete effectively in many of the chapters, Chris. And I know you've read the book, so I'll just point out a couple of instances. In the chapter on Russia, on parrying, you know, Putin's playbook, I wrote about how important it is for us to be a bit introspective, right, and to strengthen our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes, to strengthen access to authoritative sources of information, and to educate ourselves, right? We're much less vulnerable to Russian disinformation, the sustained campaign of cyber-enabled information warfare against us, if we are better educated about who we are, as well as about the issues that we're confronting, both domestically and in foreign policy. In the chapter on China and what to do about the Chinese Communist Party's campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment, the title of that chapter is "Turning Weakness into Strengths," right? And the idea is that we have to defend against various forms of Chinese aggression, which I describe in the book. But we also have to make a major effort to strengthen ourselves. And a way to think about it is to take what the Chinese Communist Party sees as weaknesses and make those into our greatest competitive advantages. So what does the Chinese Communist Party see as a weakness? That people should be able to have a say in how they're governed, right? Because that would challenge, you know, the primacy of the party and their obsession with an exclusive grip on power. So, hey, across the free world, let's strengthen our democratic processes and confidence in our democratic institutions. The Chinese Communist Party fears rule of law, because if you have rule of law and due process of law, you can't throw 1.5 million people into concentration camps, right? You can't sentence people who have who even mildly criticize, you know, Xi Jinping to 18 years in prison, as he did with one of the regime's critics just recently, or the Hong Kong protesters, or we could go on this, obviously. So they fear rule of law, because it would challenge the rule of the party. So let's strengthen rule of law. And rule of law is, I think, and promotion of it is one of the greatest bulwarks against China's exportation of its authoritarian mercantilist model. They also fear a free market economic system that works, that's effective, that people are stakeholders in, and where everyone believes that they have a chance to build a better future for their children and their grandchildren if they work hard and apply themselves. So let's strengthen, right, our free market economic system, because China doesn't want that to happen. That would counter the absolute control of the party. You know, look at the Ant IPO just recently, right, which was a signal to the so-called private sector, which doesn't really even exist in China. Hey, you know, who's in charge here? They fear freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Let's strengthen that in our democratic country. So this is a theme throughout the book, and it's in the final chapter that I really emphasize, you know, the need for us to bolster our strategic competence, to do it mainly through education. And I think a different approach to our history, Chris. I mean, I think in recent years, you know, the academy has become dominated, I think, or at least strongly influenced, let's say, by the new left interpretation of history. And I think that, you know, history departments, humanities departments should not adhere to any kind of an orthodoxy, right? There ought to be many different interpretations and schools represented. But I think in the post-Vietnam War period, you know, our study of the humanities and history in particular has been tainted by what we might call a mild form of self-loathing, in which we attribute all of the ills of the world prior to 1945 to colonialism, all of the ills of the world after 1945 to, you know, capitalist imperialism. And of course, you know, this is the basis oftentimes for an interpretation that views the United States as the problem instead of a force for good in the world. And whereas we've made our mistakes, I believe that the United States has been a force and is a force for good in the world. And so I reject kind of the, you know, the moral equivalency that you hear in some circles that criticize the United States. And I believe that we should have a better sense of our history and, you know, the great triumph of our revolution. We should acknowledge, though, you know, obviously the greatest failure in our history, which is the failure to eliminate slavery until almost, you know, 100 years later. But we should also celebrate, right, that we emancipated 4 million of our fellow Americans in the most destructive war in our history. And then, of course, we can be disappointed as historians in the failure of Reconstruction, you know, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow, you know, the separate but equal period, but also then celebrate the triumph of the civil rights movement. I mean, I think that, you know, we should recognize the triumph of the civil rights movement as dismantling de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity, but recognize de facto segregation and inequality of opportunity still exists, and we have to work on it. So I just think that what maybe our young people should take from the study of our history is what our founders recognized from the beginning, that our republic required continuous nurturing, right? And maybe that would be a way to restore confidence in who we are. So there's a lot in the book, as you know, that is introspective, that is about the United States, and you know, as somebody who has spent a lot of time, you know, abroad in countries that don't have, you know, effective representative government, that don't have rule of law, where there is a high degree of tribalism, right, and a lack of a common identity. You know, it's not a pretty picture. You know, so I think, Chris, we ought to nurture our republic and do our best, as I mentioned at the outset, you know, with Steve, to come together as Americans for respectful, meaningful discussions, and to empathize with one another too. You know, I worry about, you know, strategic empathy, but I also worry about the end of empathy here. I mean, there are some people who say, "Hey, you don't even get to empathize with me." I mean, come on, you know. And you know, I've been in the military, you know, Chris, where you see people come into the military from all different backgrounds, and of course, they carry with them, you know, biases and prejudices. And when they're put together as members of teams that have to rely on one another and they encounter hardships together, they take on the qualities of a family, and you see all those biases and prejudices, you know, melt away. You know, and when you're in combat, you know, you're not checking anybody's, you know, skin color, religion, sexual orientation, right? You're in the fight together. It's all about what you bring to that team is how you're assessed. And I think we could, you know, we could use a bit more of that in our society today as well.
Yeah,
Now, let's go to Sarah if we could, Chris, because we have quite a lineup of folks who want to ask questions, and maybe we'll ask Sarah to pose the final question, and then Natalie will instruct everybody on how to pose your question. Is that okay?
excellent.
one of the things you talk about, and you've been talking about, General, is domestic politics in direct and indirect ways. And you talk a lot, and you've again talked about kind of this will to succeed or the will to sustain the effort. And one of the things I read this piece in the Wall Street Journal a week or so ago with public opinion polls that suggested that 41% of Americans actually have no opinion of whether the U.S. has achieved its goals in Afghanistan. And one of the conclusions one could draw from that is not that we don't have yes, that there's not a will to succeed, but that people are just apathetic, that they don't have an interest in what's happening abroad. And so I'm curious, whether you can sort of ascribe some reason as to where that apathy lies and how to kind of give Americans more of the, when we are engaged in a conflict abroad, more of the political will to sustain these efforts that we're engaged in.
Yeah, Sarah. Hey, thanks for that question. I don't blame the American people for that, right? I think that I would blame American leaders for this. I think what the American people deserve to know are really two fundamental things. One is, what is at stake, right? What is at stake in this war? What is at stake even in a competition that short of war? And what's in what vital interests are at stake, and why is it important? And the second is, what is a strategy that is designed to deliver a favorable outcome at a cost acceptable to the American public? And I think American leaders across multiple administrations have failed to do that in Afghanistan. And I think it's compounded as well by the fact that in the information age, I think the Afghanistan war is the most underreported war in American history. A lot of this has to do with business models in the media associated with the focus on short-term profits and the expense, right, of having foreign correspondents on the ground, with the insurance and the security issues and everything else. So I don't think it has anything to do with media bias. I think the word's undercovered, and I think it's mainly a failure of leadership. And when a president says, "Hey, well, I'm sorry, we have to do X because public opinion is Y," then what are you doing about public opinion? Are you leading? Or are you just passively doing what you think, the latest poll says you ought to do?
All right, Natalie, would you please instruct all of our viewers on how to pose a question?
Absolutely. Thanks so much to all of our panelists tonight. So if you have a question to ask, you can look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the raised hand function, and that will put you in the queue. If you're not able to speak on the webinar, you can always use the Q&A function as well to type in your question. Our first question today will be coming from Craig Newmark. So Craig, if you could unmute yourself, please, you're all set to ask.
As far as I could tell, the election was protected pretty thoroughly against disinformation warfare, which involved a partnership coming into place quietly between people in government, people in tech, and a broad range of people in NGOs. So we've won a battle. How do we win the war? Should these efforts be led by some kind of public-private partnership, formal or informal? And if so, do you think there's a specific federal department or agency that should lead?
And General, before you answer that, I just want everybody to know that Craig Newmark knows a little bit about social media. He is the founder of Craigslist.
Yeah, I know, Craig. Craig, I wanted just to ask you the same question. In fact, so I hope you'll comment on this. All right, so I'll be quick because I'd like to hear from you if you don't mind. I mean, I'm kind of proud of of what the government's done to secure our elections since 2016. And that was in the area of setting up the cyber infrastructure security organization that the president just fired the head of. When he fired Sean. I mean, it was which he did a great job in setting the standards and then working with the states and the very decentralized system we have to make sure that to ensure the sanctity of our voting process and system associated with it. We also, as I think most people know, removed some restrictions on our cyber warriors that allowed us to combine a good offense with a good defense, a necessary component. And there has been, of course, the massive private sector response, to the sustained campaign of disinformation, not just during the 2016 election, but beyond, that allows that our social media companies take down, not just the most offensive, but the true, the really clear propaganda that's aimed at sowing disinformation and so forth. Of course, the big issue is do we want social media companies to be the arbiters of free speech? I don't think so. And so there's a real tension here, and there's no easy answer. And so Craig, I write about this a little bit in the book about what we can do. I think, instead of trying to block everything, trying to ensure that there are authoritative sources of information. There's a startup that I use as an example here that does that and provides that service. But Craig, if you don't mind, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and how well you think we're doing and what more can be done.
It's a long story, and I'm not really qualified. A guy who is qualified that you just alluded to is Chris Krebs, formerly running CISA.
Yeah.
But there is this partnership for a lot of groups who know a lot better than I do, like the folks at the Stanford Internet Observatory, the folks at Shorenstein at Harvard Kennedy, Aspen Cybersecurity Group. Those are the folks. My deal is just trying to avoid doing something stupid while I learn about the defend forward posture and to figure out what does persistent engagement mean,
right.
And how do you help the people doing the job and then get out of their way.
Yeah, I see. That's exactly. And that's where I think the public-private partnership has to be, right? Is at this nexus between defense and offense, right? And I do write about this in the book and write about the advantages and disadvantages of private sector offensive cyber operations as part of a defense, right? Which comes with a significant amount of risk. I work with Alex Stamos and the team here at Stanford on the Internet Observatory, and I think that kind of work, right, improving transparency, pulling the curtain back on advanced persistent threats, and organizations like the Internet Research Agency, that's a great first step. That's something I think we can all be confident that is important work and begins to get at the problem.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Craig.
Thank you so much. So our next question will come from Mark Minton. Mark, if you could please ask us your question, you can unmute.
Yes. Hello, sir. I just wanted to ask, when you and the 3rd ACR under your command took Talafar, the urban environment was left devoid of capable administration and order. As an experienced and senior planner, what advice can you give on the establishment of governance and your work with local leadership?
Okay. Hey, Mark. Thanks. When we assessed really the problems associated with a sectarian civil war that was actually going on at the micro level in the city of Talafar, we wanted to obviously restore services. Life had been choked out of the city. The city was largely in the control of Al Qaeda in Iraq. Basic services had been cut off. Clean water and power, for example, children hadn't gone to school for a year. The marketplaces were closed. The hospital had been turned into a place where they actually killed innocent people instead of treated them. So it was a disaster in the city. And of course, what we had to do is we had to reach the population and to try to break the cycle of sectarian violence by defeating the terrorists first, but then establishing legitimate security forces that were perceived by all of the population as legitimate and in whom they had confidence. Prior to conducting the operation, though, we assessed what needed to happen to restore basic services. So we engaged the governor and the government broadly. And so teachers were hired, school supplies were ordered and ready to go in. We had work crews standing by to reestablish the power lines. Power wasn't an issue; it was near a hydroelectric dam. We also had contracts ready for the rebuilding of police stations, for example, and the positioning of Army next to police. And so I could go on about this, but what was critical is that we needed the people to be able to take really responsibility for their own security and have confidence in their security forces. Before we conducted the operation, we tried to recruit police. We put out thousands of vouchers to sheikhs who would vouch for somebody and say, this is somebody we vetted, please come and join this nascent police force to reconstitute a police force that had been destroyed by Al Qaeda. And of all those thousands of vouchers we sent out, we got three people volunteered. After the operations, thousands of people volunteered. And so it just shows you that one of the necessary conditions to restoring services and to improving the lives of some people who suffered there for so long, was to reestablish security first. Thanks for that question, Mark.
Thank you. Our next question is coming from Virginia Davies. Virginia, if you could please unmute yourself and ask, or I can read it out from the chat.
Hello, thank you, General. Having witnessed the drone warfare personally in the combat zone of Karabakh, I just returned 3 weeks ago, and I would submit maybe that it's the very first full-fledged drone war, and the significant buildup of Russian troops now, quite significant. I wondered whether you have had an opportunity to reflect on this war, and if you have, I think it has many sort of areas of interest, but if you could share some of your thoughts.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Virginia. I think this is a trend in warfare that we saw begin with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. And then we saw this trend continue in terms of drone warfare on the recent Iranian attacks on Saudi oil facilities. This is a harbinger of more to come in terms of autonomous and semi-autonomous systems and swarm capabilities in particular. And what we're seeing now is the result in large measure of those who have studied the U.S. technological military advantages and figured out cheaper ways to take apart those advantages and to narrow that gap. And I think I view kind of this use of swarm UAS, unmanned aerial systems, in combination as part of a larger picture in which potential adversaries are adopting electronic warfare capabilities, offensive cyber capabilities, tiered and layered air defense capabilities, instead of, for example, investing in exquisite capabilities like stealth technologies. And drones are a part of this mix of capabilities that disrupt what we have taken for granted for too long as our differential advantages. But war is this continuous interaction of opposites, and militaries interact with each other in the context of wars, but also in between wars in terms of the capabilities they develop. And I think what the U.S. military is doing now is developing countermeasures to those countermeasures. And what will be immensely important to ensure military effectiveness in the future will be to have a combination of capabilities and to have systems and organizations that degrade gracefully rather than are prone to catastrophic failure. So I think that there's a lot to be studied about this war. I have not done it personally, except reading what I can in open source, but kind of superficially. I did commission a study of the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, the day that I told the story of getting that phone call to go to interview at Mar-a-Lago, I was on my way to the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia to brief the results of that study of Russian new generation warfare. So I see some continuities, between that study and what we've seen in Nagorno-Karabakh. But if you don't mind, can you share your thoughts? I mean, what did you see? You were on the ground there.
Just give me 1 second and I will get Virginia back on. All right, Virginia, if you can unmute.
Well, I've seen a great deal, I guess at a high level, I am concerned as an American. I am concerned the way that, as you would say, it was able to, the drone warfare, the swarms are able to, immediately deal with all the traditional battlefield tanks, et cetera. And quite frankly, where I would say what we might think as a secondary military power can really sort of usurp a more first degree military power. And also, quite frankly, the way, even if you have drone defense systems, the drones can be reprogrammed very quickly to deal with the drone defense that you have employed. And so that it requires a nimbleness, a tremendous nimbleness, I would say, like something probably, have not experienced before. And I also think that the civilian impact, the fear impact on the civilian of the drones is quite considerable. On the Russian side, and speaking to democracy, my concern, quite frankly, I think I have a couple of concerns. The first is obviously we now see a Russian-Turkish some kind of alliance. What does that mean in terms of Turkey and NATO? I am concerned about, you had an emerging democracy in Armenia. I think it's clear that the Karabakh side, the Armenian Karabakh, you're now basically, do we have a peacekeeping force? Do we have an occupying force? And some on the ground are quite concerned that actually Armenian sovereignty may be at risk. And also with the transit of ISIS fighters in this war, we believe potentially into Chechnya. I think we, that's the few highlights. There are more, but I think that there's great concern. And of course, then we've got Georgia as well.
Yeah.
And now basically you've got, certainly more than the stated number of Russian troops that were supposed to be there for peacekeeping on the ground. And obviously have to be concerned about Georgia as well.
Well, hey, thanks, Virginia. I mean, there's so much that we could pick up on, but I'll see what the other questions are. A lot to talk about in connection with Turkey. I write about extensively in the book, and I think it's just worth noting that despite this alignment with Russia, they're on opposite sides in Nagorno-Karabakh, as they are in Idlib in Syria, and as they are in Libya as well. So maybe in a post-Erdogan Turkey at some point, there'll be some buyer's remorse in connection with, with this relationship and Turkey's move away from the West, which I think is a very significant geopolitical shift and directly against our interests. But thank you so much, Virginia.
Thank you. So our next question, I'm going to ask Barbara, Doblas. Barbara, if you would like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. General, I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion of the current atmosphere in the Middle East, in particular with Israel and her neighbors? Several countries are warming or have warmed up to diplomatic relations with Israel. And is this positive situation sustainable? Are there future risks that may arise due to the methods that were used to bring about this change in the neighborhood? And what do you predict happens next?
Right. Well, hey, thanks for that question, Barbara. I think it's extremely positive, right? I mean, it's not very often that you get positive news out of the Middle East, and when we do, we ought to take a minute to celebrate it. I think it reflects the reality that the Gulf Arab states, and the vast majority of them, really view Iran as the greatest threat to their security, and therefore actually see their security interests aligning with those of Israel. I think what's extremely important about this is the progress that can be made with the normalization of these relations to isolating jihadist terrorist organizations from ideological sources of support, and a recognition, hey, that we are all people of the book, and those takfirin and those who actually inflict, so much violence and suffering on their fellow Muslims are the enemies of all humanity. And this is not a religious war. It's a war with criminals who use violence to advance a political and criminal agenda. So I think there's great possibility there, as well as there are significant possibilities with a collective approach to defending against Iran's effort to perpetuate a sectarian civil war in the region, and to really apply the Hezbollah model broadly to the region, in which they have weak powers, weak governments in power that are beholden to Iran for a degree of support, while Iran grows militias outside of those governments' control that can be turned against those governments if they act against Iranian interests. This is the case in Lebanon, and this is the case in Syria or Iraq, and this is what they're trying to do in Yemen as well. So I think there can be positive momentum in this connection in terms of regional security and normalization of relations with Israel. But I think the effects are to potentially both weaken Iran as well as weaken jihadist terrorists. I think there's much more to be done, obviously, to arrest this cycle of sectarian violence that is perpetuating state weakness and so much human suffering in the region. But I see it as a positive step. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. So it looks like we have time for one last question. I'm going to go to Bev Tyler, who's in the chat. She says, looking to the future of the United States, can we find a way to reintroduce civics education into our education system? And how important do you think that is?
I think it's really important. That's a great question. I do write about this in the final chapter of Battlegrounds, and so I think that this is an essential element to restoring our confidence in our common identity as Americans, as well as confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. You know, for example, just in this election and the president's claims of widespread fraud and saying the election is rigged, and then of course associated concerns is, will the president, leave? And then what you have is you have the president's message really risking, I think, and diminishing to a certain extent potentially our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions. But then on the other side, right, you have other actors on the other side of the political spectrum, those who are against the president. I mean, suggesting that the military might have a role, for example, like in the transition, which is extraordinarily irresponsible and inaccurate. If we understood more about our founding, we would know that, our founders drew lessons from the bloody wars of England in the 17th century. And one of the reasons our Constitution was so strong is because it was based on worst case scenarios. One worst case scenario was somebody like an Oliver Cromwell, and therefore the emphasis in our Constitution on a bold line between the military and partisan politics. A line that our politicians should not try to draw the military across to score partisan points. And then another element of the strength of our Constitution is actually the executive branch has no say in the transition, and once the votes are cast on December 14th, they'll be decided. If it was a situation in which there were an inadequate number of electoral votes, it would go to the House of Representatives. If at the state level, as we have seen, or at the federal level, there are issues, those would be settled in the judiciary. So the executive branch doesn't have a role. And so just knowing, I'm just trying to give an example of the importance of civics education. It's an immensely important initiative, I think. We're weak in it now, and I think that it's compounded by really the new left interpretation of history, the revisionist school, of the 70s and into the 80s, really now dominating our interpretation of our history as well, in not only in academia, in higher education, but in secondary education and even in primary education. So again, it'd be wrong to, sort of, impose some contrived happy view of our history. But I think there is a corrective needed, and we should reject any kind of orthodoxy in that connection.
General, before I thank you properly, as well as Chris and Sarah, that's a perfect segue. Your thoughts on this describe the function of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University. It is why we exist, in order to deepen that discourse in the classroom all the way to the Congress. We want to facilitate those conversations at a higher level. And so thank you for alluding to that. Let me say again, Battlegrounds by H.R. McMaster, a phenomenal book. Natalie has given you instructions on how you can secure a copy. If you want an around the world tour and a strategic threat assessment with some pragmatic and practical solutions, I recommend that you read it. Tomorrow night, Abe Foxman talking about the state of anti-Semitism around the world. A week from today, a conversation about polling, what went wrong, what went right, what we can look forward to, or what we should anticipate in the future, and a very active series of programs in 2021. General H.R. McMaster, thank you for your service. Thank you for educating us. Thank you for everything that you have done for our country. Chris and Sarah, thank you for participating in this and other programs. And we hope everybody remains safe and healthy. So long, everybody.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Oh.